Back in the late 80s and early 90s, Davilyn Dobbs was a sheriff's deputy in Kansas City, Kansas.
I worked at the sheriff's department, so I worked in the jail. So my perspective with the police officers was a little different.
KCK is the county seat of Wyandotte County. The city and the county have a unified local government, which includes both a police department and a sheriff's office. The sheriff's office runs the county jail.
But there's always been this rivalry or dislike between the sheriff's department and KCK PD. That relationship itself wasn't even good. So, after I had left the sheriff's department, they didn't bother me, I didn't bother them. There were a few that I had no respect for because the police department and the sheriff's department, it's a good old boys club. You scratch my back, I scratch yours type of thing.
Long before she met Roger Golubski, Davilyn Dobbs heard rumors about a police detective. She didn't hear about him at work, but from relatives who live near Quindaro Boulevard.
Now, I did have relatives that lived down in, we call the projects off of 3rd Street. And people down there talked about, they just said a police officer. They never said his name, never described him, but you could tell by the conversations they were all talking about the same person. But he'd be down there sleeping with women, harassing people, and it was mostly black women, single black women with children.
Being part of the law enforcement community, it gave Davilyn a different perspective on the rumors she was hearing. Not that she dismissed them exactly, she just took them with a grain of salt.
So you take it as, just the stories that people are saying. And the black community didn't have a good relationship with police, sheriffs, anybody of authority. So I just took it as, stories as going around in the neighborhood down in the projects. I had heard about him, but I didn't know it was him because nobody identified him by name or anything. Oh, okay, these women are talking, but, it's just stories that they're passing around.
Just stories. Until Detective Roger Golubski showed up at her door. I'm Josie Duffy Rice, and this is Corruption Uncovered, a podcast from Rock Nation and its philanthropic and justice division, Team Rock.
I first came in contact with him. There was a shooting at an old address of mine. A car full of boys came by to shoot up my house.
So to explain why shots were fired at her house, I'm going to back up just a little. Davilyn has 3 sons, Dion, Donnell, and D'Angelo. Donnell is her middle child.
Donnell has always been a mama's boy, but he's always liked sports. He's been in football most of his life. Very smart. He was a good student. And he stuck up under me a lot. The other 2 went out and played, but he liked to stay in with me and follow me around. He's quiet. He'll stay off in a room by himself and do his own thing. But he's also social. Donnie's just, his size intimidates people because he's kind of big, but he has a good heart. He's real soft-hearted. I don't know where he got that from, though. Because his dad and I, not that.
As a teenager, Donnell had a running conflict with another group of boys.
It started out with fighting and escalated to shooting, and we were concerned about our children, of course, and theirs, because we didn't want no one to get hurt. So we were trying to talk with the police and try to come to a resolution to see what we could do to get this to stop with whatever was going on. But it had started out with fist fighting between the groups of boys.
Davilyn says that one day, a car full of young men drove past her house. She was out, and Donnell was home with his little brother. He called his mom, asking her to rush home, but shots were fired before she got there. And Donnell shot back, acting out of fear for his brother, Davilyn says.
And on my way home, I went past the car, and the police had them pulled over, had the car full of boys pulled over who came by and shot at my house. And Golubski was one of the officers. I didn't know that at the time because I had never seen him prior to that. So they did end up taking Donnell and my youngest son, who was in middle school at the time, to the jail to question them. And they sent my youngest son back home, but they kept Donnell.
Davilyn says officers stayed behind to clean up the shells and gather evidence, and among them was Roger Golubski. At first, he left Davilyn alone, she says. But her sons were a different story.
My oldest son, Davilyn Dobbs, he would pull him over for no reason. If he saw him out driving, he'd pull him over and search his car. If he saw them anywhere, he would harass them. And I didn't know it at first because Davilyn didn't tell me. And then Roger Golubski pulled me over.
Davilyn had left her house, driving to work just a few blocks away.
And he approached me in the car and he said, you know your sons are causing trouble out here in the streets, and everything that's happening has to do with them. They're involved some type of way. And, you know, if you want to keep them out of trouble, you and I can have a sexual relationship and I'll help keep them out of trouble.
So he just says this like it's just like a deal he's willing to make. And
yes.
And what was your reaction?
I told him I will not. Why would I have a sexual contact with you? Because my sons haven't done anything.
Right.
And he said it really doesn't matter if they do anything or not. He said, I can arrest them. And I said, that's not right because they haven't done anything. And there's no way that I would have sex with you. That's just not in my moral compass at all. I feel like I was a strong Black woman. I'm raising 3 sons. And for him as a police officer, a detective, to approach you in that way, it just made me feel belittled or like a piece of meat or something. And at the same time, I was surprised with him being a police officer for him to be as direct as he was. I perceived him as very arrogant, very arrogant. He's going to say what he wants to say. He's going to do what he wants to do. And nobody's going to tell him anything otherwise. And when things are happening to you, you feel it's only happening to you. I was very shocked. I mean, he made it seem like, you know, this is your offer, this is what you need to do, and that's it. And I told him it's not happening. My sons haven't done anything. There's no reason for you to be harassing me or anything else. And he told me, well, I need you to think about it. You think about it and you let me know.
It just shows to me just how brazen and, you know, corrupt he really was, because I'm like, you would do this to someone who has worked in law enforcement? Like, you're not scared of anything.
Right. Like I said, he was very arrogant, very sure of himself, and it was intimidating. Now, on this first occasion, he wasn't aggressive. It was just like, as a matter of fact, this is what you can do. Think about it, and I'll get back with you, type of thing. I was upset, and I didn't tell anybody because, like I said, when it happened, you feel like it's just happening to you. And he is a policeman, so who do you tell? Where do you go? I mean, and I didn't tell my sons because they are very protective of me, so I didn't say anything to them.
And the boys had their own problems.
How are you feeling as a mom at this point?
I'm worried every time they go out the door. They were in high school by that time, and my grandmother had given Dion her car because she wasn't able to drive anymore. They were driving back and forth to school, but every time they went out that door, I worried about them because when they come back, there was bullet holes in the car.
Davilyn says she tried again to resolve the tensions, reaching out to the families of the other boys and to the KCKPD.
When we went out to the community policing, they asked me if I had any relatives that live out of town that I could send my kids to. That was their resolution. And Dion had a baby by then, and he wasn't going to go anywhere. So I couldn't get any help from anybody. I tried, but when you can't get any help from the police, the people that's there to help you, what do?
Right. And their advice is move.
Send my kids to relatives out of town somewhere. That was the only option I was given.
So Davilyn and her sons moved, not out of town, but to a new neighborhood. She was hoping for some reprieve from both the shooting and from Golubski.
I didn't have any more problems with Golubski because I had moved. But my son, oldest son, Dion, was still having problems with him harassing him, pulling him over, stopping him, searching his car, searching him, just whenever he felt like it, for no reason.
But eventually, Davilyn says she had another run-in with Golubski.
He pulled me over 2 blocks away from my mom's house. There's a monastery. It used to be a monastery. It's a V. Lindsay Christian school now. And they had built like a multi-purpose building next to their building that was in the process of being built. He pulled me over right up there on that street where that school is, and he told me he wanted me to follow him over there to where they were building that multi-purpose room. There was nothing over there but that place. And I said, there's no way I'm going, in my head, I didn't say this to him, there's no way I'm going over there because he's going to hurt me or try to do something to me. So I'm not going over there. Now, where he stopped me, there was homes on one side of the street and then that big V. Lindsay school on the other side. And so at this time, he was very forceful with me. He was telling me, not asking me, that I was going to follow him over there to that school because he just wanted to talk to me. I said, you have me pulled over here. You could talk to me right here. Because I figured since we were sitting in front of these houses, I was safe that if he did anything, somebody might see it. But if I followed him or went over there to that parking lot and where they were building this building, I didn't have a chance. So I told him, no, I'm not going anywhere with you. You have me pulled over now. Whatever you need to say, you say to me right here. Now, we're kind of yelling back and forth at each other because, like I said, this time he was forceful with it. Like, he wasn't asking me. He was telling me this is what I was going to do. And he said, I gave you an option the first time we talked. I told you to think about it. What are you going to do? I said, again, I'm not sleeping with you. My children have done nothing. He said, like I told you, it doesn't matter if they do anything or not. They can be locked up. And I said, but why would you do that? You're supposed to be out here protecting us. Why are you harming children of all people? Because I won't sleep with you? And at the time, he was married to a black woman. So I'm not understanding what his thirst was for sex from women. I just didn't understand it.
And at this point, when you guys are talking, are you feeling scared?
I was scared this time. The first time I wasn't scared, I was just shocked. This time, I was nervous and I was scared because of the way he was so forceful with his conversation with me. And I'm like, no, there's no way. I have to save me. I said, I'm not sleeping with you to save my children because nothing has happened. They've done nothing. I don't know what your issue is, but I'm not doing. He said, you're going to follow me over here to this building. And I told him, I'm not following you. And I just took off. And I drove to my mom's house, which was 2 blocks around the corner. And I was so nervous. I pulled up in front of her garage and I just sat there and I looked to see if he had followed me. He hadn't followed me. I didn't see him go behind me and down the street because if he had followed me, I would have seen him. But I didn't know if he had went around the corner and was coming back. I mean, because he knew where my parents stayed. So I just sat there and I was so nervous that when I calmed down, I just took off and went back home.
He didn't follow her that day, but he also didn't forget about her or her sons. In October of 2008, there was a shooting at a barber shop. 2 men were shot and 1 was killed.
2 weeks later, I get a phone call at my home on 83rd from the police department asking for Donnell. And I said, Donnell's not here. And he said, well, do you know where he's at? I was like, yes, I do. And he said, well, do you think you can get him to your house? I'm like, sure. What is this about? They like, we just want to question him. I said, question him about what? We just need to talk to him. And I'm standing in my kitchen window and I look out and I see all these officers running up my front yard from across the street from my house and down the street. And they was just surrounded the house. And Donnell and Dion had just walked in the house. There was about 30 to 40 police officers with guns and everything drawn out on us. And they put Donnell in a car and took off. And I said, I thought you said you just needed to talk to him. You could have talked to him here. And why are they leaving with him? Well, we need to question him about a shooting. And I'm like, what shooting? And he told me about the shooting that happened at a barbershop. And then I never saw him again. He was incarcerated and went to court and was convicted, and he never came home.
Donnell was charged with and convicted for the shooting at the barbershop. He has always insisted that he had nothing to do with the shooting. Davilyn says that her son's whereabouts were accounted for that entire afternoon, that they picked her up from work and attended a funeral. As it happens, police were surveilling that funeral, taking pictures of the mourners, including her sons, Davilyn says. The night that Donnell was arrested, the last night his mother saw him as a free man, she says that Roger Golubski was there at her house.
Golubski was at my home that night when he got arrested. He was one of the officers. And then he was there after they arrested him. He was at my house every day for a week. He was coming out on my property. The boyfriend I had at the time, he used to buy cars and fix them up and sell them off. So we had a lot of cars at our house. So he was back there. And I'm like, why are you out here? You've arrested my son. Why are you here? Why do you keep harassing me? Well, we're just checking these cars to make sure they're legal and they're all tagged. I said, you did that the other night when you were here. You've been here every day for a week since you arrested my son. And for what? All the cars were legal. All the cars was tagged. There was no problem. But you here every day. Why? I told you I was going to get your sons. That's what he said. I said, why are you harassing me? What's the problem? What is the issue? What problem are we having here? I mean, because you've been stopping my sons, I found out, harassing them. You done pulled me over a couple of times to harass me, and now you done arrested my son. And all along, you've been asking for sexual favors, and yes, you did tell me you was going to get my son, and now you have, but for what? And he said, because I can. That's all he said.
At trial, Donnell was convicted of first-degree murder and attempted murder, with no physical evidence, no DNA or fingerprints or video. The case rested on the testimony of one eyewitness.
They didn't have any evidence, none. No gun, no weapon, no fingerprints, no nothing. Just one of the boys that got shot saying that it was Donnell. Now, the day that this happened, the boy's statement was he didn't know who had shot him. But then all of a sudden, 2 weeks later, it was my son. And he was one of the boys that my son was having issues with. They had problems off and on. And all of a sudden, it's my son. Now, they arrested other people and questioned them and let them go. But all of a sudden, it's my son. That was suspicious to me.
When he gets convicted, did you feel like maybe there was a chance he would not get convicted, given that, like, there wasn't any evidence?
Yeah, he had a co-defendant who they found innocent, but you convict my son. They're co-defendants. They're on the same case. They're there at the same time. How do you find one innocent and one guilty? And the witness said he saw both of them. So I was totally floored. I was no good when they sent my son to prison. None whatsoever. None. When he got convicted, he has a co-defendant sitting at the table and he's innocent, but my son is guilty? I couldn't understand it. And the attorney that Donnie had, he was appointed, court appointed, but he didn't even call Donnie's witnesses, didn't even use them. They were there at court. They couldn't sit in there. They was outside waiting because they couldn't sit inside, but he never even called any of them. Not a one.
After her son's arrest and then his conviction, Davilyn was racked with guilt.
After he arrested my son, I was hurt. I was devastated, and still now, today, I know that it's not my fault, but I feel guilty. I feel like part of the reason my son is in jail is because I said no to this man for sexual advances, only because I said no to him. And I know it's not my fault, but I feel that way. That's the way I feel. But when he arrested my son, I was so hurt. I didn't know what to do or who to talk to or if I could have stopped anything. Who's to say if I did sleep with the man, it's not guaranteed that my son still wouldn't be sitting there. So I didn't learn about his other victims until my son was already arrested.
Other victims like Rosie McIntyre, mother of Lamont, who was allegedly sexually assaulted by Roger Golubski, who then framed her son for murder. When did you start talking to people and telling people what your experience had been with Roger Golubski? Because I know you said you didn't want to share it with people. You definitely don't want to share it with your sons. They were really protective.
I didn't say anything about my interaction with Golubski too. Donnell was locked up probably about 10 years. I didn't tell my sons. I didn't tell any to my parents. I didn't say anything until I found out about Lamont McIntyre's mom. I heard about her story. And at the time, she was coming up to the prison to see her son, and I just froze. And Donnie was like, "What's the matter?" And I just started crying. I started crying because now there's someone else that knows how I feel. She was physically assaulted. I was not. But still, the mental anguish and the fact of me carrying this guilt, because I'm like, my son is sitting in jail because I told him no. And then to hear her story, I'm like, oh my God. So I told my sons for the first time, both of them, we was in the prison visitation room when I told them, because they had no idea. They had no idea. And I was crying. I told them I didn't know how to tell y'all. I figured that I could handle this on my own, and I didn't want y'all getting involved because I know how protective you guys are. But I just been feeling so alone, but there's somebody else that knows what I'm talking about. And then after her story, I started hearing stories of other women that came up missing, dead, different sex workers and different things, and it was just overwhelming.
And how did your family react and your sons react and the people around you when you told them? What was their reaction?
Well, of course, my sons was like, "Why didn't you tell us?"
Right.
And I said, you know why? Because you guys are protective, and I didn't want you to be sitting in here for hurting somebody for real. And my ex-husband and I both worked at the sheriff's department. I never told him till about 5 years ago. He found out because he worked closely with Roger Golubski, kind of. He was at the sheriff's department, but they worked on some drug cases or something before. He had no idea what was going on, and they were really upset, very upset that I had been carrying this around for so long.
When Lamont McIntyre was exonerated, what Roger Golubski allegedly did to both Rosie and Lamont started to come to light. And then slowly, the machinery of the legal system finally began to grind through Golubski's old cases. In 2020, the district attorney, Mark Dupree, expanded the Conviction Integrity Unit and renamed it the Community Integrity Unit. The group was charged with investigating claims of wrongful convictions and police misconduct.
When the DA Dupree formed the Integrity Unit, they went through cases and called us and told us that Donnell's case was one of the ones that they picked. Donnell had to fill out an application or fill out something to send to them, and they picked Donnell's case because they said it was a lot of things that just didn't look right. So he said he didn't feel that Donnell had done the crime. He was turning it over to some group they were going to go through, and he presented and laid the case out. And if they came to the same conclusion, he was going to the DA's office.
When you hear that they're going to go to the DA's office, how are you feeling?
I'm feeling hopeful. I'm thinking my son's going to be able to come home soon. I'm feeling so much better that somebody's listening and believes and understands, all the things that's been going on, and that somebody's listening to me and believes in us. And then we get the message that everybody's fired in the integrity unit, everybody.
The 3 members of the Community Integrity Unit were fired in May of 2021, after one member of the unit recorded the other 2 making racist, homophobic, and anti-Semitic remarks. They were fired, as was the whistleblower. And how did you feel at that point?
I was so disappointed. So they told us, they got to go back to square one. They got to get the office filled again, get the positions filled, and get everybody up to speed. And they were going to start all over with another investigation. So I felt defeated.
That was almost 4 years ago. Davilyn says she tried to meet with DA Dupree after the unit fell apart, but never heard back. And she says they haven't heard anything from the unit or the DA since. But over those years, the secrets of Roger Golubski were starting to come out. In 2022, Golubski was federally indicted twice on charges including aggravated sexual assault, kidnapping, and involuntary sexual servitude. And people started to speak up about what he had allegedly done to them, including Davilyn. She first spoke in public about what he did to her family in May 2024 at a press conference in Topeka.
It was very emotional for me. I was fine until I stepped up to the mic and all the emotion came up and I started crying. So it was very releasing for me. It was good to speak about it, to get it out, to let the public know what's really been going on. And it's very disheartening to have these feelings and not be able to tell law enforcement who's there to help you, or you feel like you're alone. So you just left to deal with it on your own, and it's very difficult. Because, I'm a mother, first of all. I got 3 sons, and I'm going to go all the way to the end and defend any of them, like any mother would. So to be blocked and censored and not believed and unheard, it was just horrible. It's a horrible feeling.
Davilyn was planning to speak in another venue, the courtroom. She was one of the so-called other victims listed as part of the first case slated for trial and was scheduled to testify. But then, of course, Roger Golubski was found dead, reportedly by suicide, on the first morning of the trial.
I was sad because I don't wish death on anybody, but I felt robbed because this is my thing. This man sat at home for over 2 years on house arrest. With the charges that he had against him, first of all, to me, that was a slap in the face. And then the day that he's supposed to show up in court, it was too much for him. He kills himself. It just didn't seem right to me because, like I stated before, Roger Golubski was a very arrogant man, and I don't feel like he would kill himself. I just don't. I just can't wrap my mind around that. But it was very hard to hear. And then I immediately started worrying about my son. What does this mean for my son? Are we going to have to go back to square one and start all over again? Because we've been doing that for over 6 years, starting over with everybody. And, they say justice takes time, but it's real swift when they're incarcerating your family. Justice takes time when you're trying to get them out. And to watch him suffer and go through the things he's been going through up here at this prison, it's hard to deal with. But I can't quit now. I can't stop now. And I'm going to be there for my son until he comes home. I'm determined. I mean, I was scared and nervous to testify, but it had to be said. And I was going to do whatever I needed to do to help my child. We need to get these stories out, and we need these people in law enforcement and in power to listen. That's all we was asking for, is for them to listen. And we couldn't get that.
Donnell Dobbs is still in prison, where he's been for about 16 years. Davilyn says she visits him every weekend.
We talk about everything. He was more upbeat than I was. He's like, Mama, we just got to trust and believe. We got to trust and believe in God. And we know that I didn't do this. So we just got to trust and believe in the people that are here to help us. So that's what I'm doing.
But that trust can be hard to hold on to, because now that Golubski is dead, there's a story taking hold. That he was one bad apple, and maybe he did terrible things, but they were a long time ago, and the rest of the apples are fine.
That's so far from the truth. He was one man, definitely, but he wasn't the only one. That man worked at the Kansas Police Department for over 30 years. And you can't tell me that he was the only one. Where did he learn that behavior from? And he was not the only one. There's others. They have lawsuits against them right now. He was allowed to do what he was doing because nobody cared about the black and brown women in this community.
A local radio station, KCUR, organized a community gathering after Golubski's death. The station invited the mayor, the police chief, and DA Dupree.
They were all invited, and none of them showed up. This was a chance for the victims to come and speak and say what they needed to say to the leaders in this community, and they didn't have the decency to show up to listen to us. I wanted them to hear us and then hear what you're going to do going forward, because there's nothing you can do about what happened. I understand that. But going forward, what can you do to ensure our safety and that this does not keep happening? And by you not showing up lets me know you don't care about what happened, or about our feelings, or about what we have to say. And that's a horrible feeling to have, living in a community that I was born and grew up in all my life and worked in, and know that they don't care. And if you don't care, who's going to care?
Dr. Nikia Smith Robert is trying to make sure that people do care. Because even though she's not from KCK, turning a blind eye to the harm there was not an option.
I think the case chose me. And the more I learned about it, it became very personal. Became very personal to me because I grew up poor to a single Black mother in Harlem, New York. And I have a brother who is justice impacted. And I have friends who I grew up with who are still serving sentences, life. And it could have been me as a Black woman myself, as a Black mother myself, raising Black daughters and a Black son. Their story is my story. It's our story.
When Dr. Nikia, as she likes to be called, first visited KCK, she had a pretty strong reaction to the city.
It just was not a pleasant experience. And it just felt like the movie Get Out. It just felt like a place where I wasn't safe.
Her cab driver in Kansas City, Missouri, disparaged KCK, talking about those people on that side of town. And when she left, she thought she'd never go back.
That was it for me. And then, of course, coming from New York City, where I was born and raised, and living in California, my only perception of Kansas was somewhere finding Dorothy and Toto and the Wizard of Oz.
But then, in a twist of fate, she got a job offer at the University of Kansas. And once she settled there, her feelings shifted.
But what I did see now being there for more than 2 years is that Kansas is so much more, right? Especially when you reclaim this narrative of abolition and the freedom struggles that happened there against slavery.
We talked about this in our first episode, that Kansas was the site of big consequential political battles over slavery and freedom, particularly Kansas City, Kansas, and especially the neighborhood of Quindaro. Dr. Nikia is the assistant professor of religious ethics and social justice at University of Kansas. And as she was planning her classes, she knew that she wanted to teach her students about that history of liberation struggle. And more than that, she wanted to bring that history into the present.
So what we wanted to do is, how do we connect that history, right? The role of religion in abolitionist movements historically, in order to free Black people. How do we connect that to modern day abolitionist movements, also focused on freeing Black people, not from slavery, but from its evolution, which is prisons and the U.S. carceral state.
She created a class called Jailbirds and Jayhawks, Abolition in Bleeding Kansas.
And I designed this course in partnership with Team Rock because I really wanted to center the Roger Golubski case. And I wanted to find ways to connect KU, this university on the Hill, to the trenches of people who were suffering state violence in the valleys, particularly in KCK.
Her class invites students to engage with the role of the church, of religion, past and present, in social change, both as a progressive force and as a force of repression.
And so I was able to take an approach, an interreligious kind of comparative approach to this class to say, yes, we're talking about the revolutionary Jesus, right? The Jesus that turned over tables to protest capitalism, the Jesus that was ethnically profiled, arrested on trumped up charges, died a criminal's death by a state-sanctioned execution, a Jesus that worked to overturn Rome, that this is, the revolutionary Jesus, not the Jesus of white Christian nationalism.
Part of the course was teaching students about the alleged harms done by Roger Golubski and the KCKPD, which most of them, despite being largely from Kansas, didn't know about.
They were completely appalled to hear about the atrocities committed by Roger Golubski that targeted Black women and mothers, their sons, their families, their communities. I think they had a sense of appreciation to learn the history of Lawrence and how that connected to KU. So the connection that we made was the mascot for KU is a jayhawk, right? And the jayhawk is a mythical bird that has connections to abolition, particularly in connection to the Jayhawkers, which were a group of people who were fighting for Kansas to be a free state. So they had an appreciation for learning that. They also had appreciation to see the connection between the historical abolition. Quindaro was a stop on the Underground Railroad historically, but also Quindaro community was where Roger Golubski targeted his victims, right? And so that's a sharp contrast between Quindaro being a site of freedom and Quindaro also later on being a site of state violence and corruption.
The students didn't just study history in the classroom. They went on field trips to stops on the Underground Railroad and local museums, and they helped organize. They formed a student group to support survivors of KCKPD violence. They held a vigil after Golubski's death and the canceled trial. This, to put it mildly, is not a standard course offering, asking students to draw connections between religion, politics, past, present, and then act on it. That's not your typical religious studies 101. I asked Dr. Nikia how she came to focus so much of her energy on the current crisis in KCK.
I grew up in the same building as the Central Park Five. So Kevin Richardson was my next door neighbor. Yusef Salam and Corey Wise also lived in the building. There was a sixth boy, Stephen Lopez, who also lived in my building. And Raymond Santana and Antoine McCrae lived just a few blocks away. So I grew up at the height of the war on drugs, the height of the crack epidemic, as the prison industrial complex is growing exponentially, the criminalization of poverty, particularly through welfare. And from the span of walking from my building to where I went to school, 4 blocks away, I passed public housing, I passed corner boys who were selling crack. I passed gangs. I passed a methadone clinic, right? All in the span of those 4 blocks. I also passed these towers where police planted in my community to surveil, right? And to instill fear in the people, to give the message that they were watching us. I have trauma from policing that I can always identify a police car around me, that there is something psychologically that if I see black and white while I'm on the highway, I immediately look to see if it's a cop car, right? That there is a traumatization that happens with policing in America that happens in Harlem, New York, the same way as it happened in KCK.
Dr. Nikia brings that life history to her work at University of Kansas and to her work as founder of an organization called Abolitionist Sanctuary.
Our purpose is to train Black servant churches, civic organizations, and educational institutions to unite against the moral crisis of mass incarceration and the criminalization of impoverished Black motherhood.
Given that the name of the organization has the word abolition in it, I thought Dr. Nikia might have insight on a question that I've been grappling with, which is that the federal trial of Roger Golubski involved people putting a lot of hope into a system that has in many ways failed them, with the potential outcome of him serving multiple life sentences in prison. And abolitionists believe that ultimately prisons should not exist. And so how do we square those realities? That prisons are sites of great harm, and also that sending someone to prison can sometimes feel like justice.
What you're hinting on, for me as an abolitionist, it's the idea that the system doesn't work, that we can't look for justice within an unjust system, right? That how do we build something better so that Black women, Black mothers, Black communities, those who are vulnerable can find sanctuary? And for me, sanctuary is how do we repair harms, restore relationships, and rebuild more just and equitable systems for communal thriving, right? What does that look like? It does not look like the corrupt legal and criminal system in Kansas City, Kansas. And here's the other thing is I think we become too fixated on punishing individuals. And I think this case shows us the fault in that, because we focus so much on punishing him that when he was unlivened, we had nothing, right? And so it's not how do we punish individuals, it's how do we hold accountable the larger system? How do we shift the conversation from punishment to accountability that gives us a way into creating these abolitionist futures, right? Because the ultimate goal of abolition is to no longer have prisons. So what do we do with the Roger Golubskis of the world then, right? And how do we correct things beforehand? I mean, there are stories of him harming a woman in his office in the precinct, a police officer barging in, seeing the act, doing nothing, and leaving, right? So for me, it's those 3 points is, how do we dismantle the system? We can't look into the system for justice for a system that is already unjust. We can't focus on individuals because when things happen to individuals, we still have to rectify those harms. And we have to move from punishment to narratives of abolition that are rooted in accountability and transformative justice.
That is the question to me. How do we do all those things and also bring whatever healing is possible to the people in KCK who have survived great suffering? How can those wrongly convicted get new trials? How do we get the answers we need from a police department that, as we talked about last episode, is still not even providing the documents that Team Rock and others have been seeking for years?
In terms of what hasn't come to light, it's always impossible to know, especially because the longer we go without a full transparent review, the more time there is for evidence not only to be destroyed, but for people to pass away, for people to move away, for things to happen where you can no longer have access to that information.
Tricia Rojo Bushnell from the Midwest Innocence Project.
As someone who works in wrongful convictions, I think about the people who are wrongfully incarcerated, folks don't get good medical care in prison. Pete Coons died 108 days after he was released because he had cancer all throughout his body that had gone undiagnosed and untreated while he was in prison. And folks like John Calvin passed away in prison before his case could be fully reviewed and presented in a court. And so whatever we do find will always be smaller than what was there, just because we've lost people already. When we think about sort of the scope of harm, well, first of all, we're talking about generations. So that's already a huge harm. And I would say in particular for the Black community in Kansas City, Kansas, it's hard to find people who aren't impacted by it in some way. And so you think about that, and you think about generations, and you think about how that impacts how they'll raise their children, the financial resources they have to raise their children and the next generation, our beliefs that we have in this system at all, right? And even if you move away, even if you go somewhere else, those experiences and those beliefs come with us. And so when I think about what do we owe folks, again, wouldn't the system want people to believe in it? Shouldn't it want to say, we need to fix this? Because then what's our point in existing if we're just a broken system that doesn't care if anyone believes in us?
Next week, Tricia and many others on how we and how you can help shape what happens next on the final episode of this season of Corruption Uncovered. And you can follow the fight at corruptionuncoveredpodcast.com and at Team Rock, ROC, on socials. Corruption Uncovered is a podcast from Rock Nation and its philanthropic and justice division, Team Rock. Team Rock partners with the Midwest Innocence Project to uncover corruption in Kansas City, Kansas. We want to extend a special thanks to the KCK community of survivors and advocates. Corruption Uncovered is produced by Pineapple Street Studios. I'm your host, Josie Duffy Rice. This episode was written and produced by me and Kat Aaron, with additional production support from Justine Dahm, Eric Minnell, and Yanker Rickford Angwin. Our editor is Joel Lovell, fact-checking by Will Tavlin, music licensing by Epidemic Sound. Our recording engineers are Pedro Alvira and Marina Pais. Mixing by Marina Pais. Kat Aaron and J.N. Berry are our executive producers. Thanks to Joshua Jackson for his help, and thank you for listening.